Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is episode number 53 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today in our panel we have Danny Blue.
Hey everybody.
And myself, Erik Isaksen. And we're going to be talking about Angular 2 today, diving into that. And our guest today is Pascal Precht.
Hello there.
Please, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So, my name is Pascal Precht, by the way.
I am sorry I butchered that.
All good, all good. I'm a software engineer and trainer, so I'm pretty into Angular stuff, and have been built a couple of applications, and I'm currently running a lot of workshops, trainings, and building software. That's what I'm doing.
And you've been working a lot with Angular and Angular 2. I know you've been in the Angular community for a long time. You've been doing some talks, and recently you started blogging again.
That's right. Yeah. So I started working with Angular about 3.5 years ago, like before it was cool. Christoph, a friend of mine, also my colleague at Thoughtram, where we are doing those workshops. He actually he was the one that brought me to the Angular world, because he kind of saw that framework in the wild somewhere, and then he said, "This is so awesome. Why is nobody using it? And this is so great." And then he started out on that one. So since then I'm using it, and I've built a couple of applications with it, a couple of mobile applications, and I've also built an open source project called Angular Translate, which is an Angular module to make internationalization easy in your Angular applications. And it's like super community driven. Like, even I think I haven't really contributed to it since almost a year now. Like, I haven't done any commits or anything. So this is currently driven by a team and the community, and that's great. Yeah, and that's also another thing that I really love about this whole Angular world, which is really the community, because there are so many nice people you can get in touch with.
Yeah, no, the Angular community is really big. I think what anybody that's been following the Angular world now, everybody's probably heard of Angular 2 and kind of the big departure from the current, from 1.x to 2.0 is a really big change. Really quick, can you go over just like what some of those differences are between Angular 1.x, so like we're on 1.4.1 something right now, and 2.0? And
sure.
Yeah, so please go ahead.
Okay, so I think the very first announcement of Angular 2, or that there's something in the making called Angular 2, happened last year at ngConf already, I guess. So like over 1.5 years ago now, maybe even earlier, I'm not sure. And last year at NG Europe, the European Angular conference, they the team showed a couple of syntax examples on how Angular, or what Angular 2 applications could look like. And this is where I think the internet started hating Angular 2 or the Angular project, because it looked so different, and it's like everything is different, and whatever we learned in the last couple of months we can't use it anymore, and everything.
I remember those slides on Twitter. People's jaws dropped.
Exactly, yeah. So, because, they really announced a lot of new stuff, like new syntax, and everything is, at that time, everything was written in ES6 or even AtScript, and these kind of things, and then like things like we don't have scope anymore, we don't have controllers anymore, there's no two-way data binding, and like, oh my gosh, what's going on there? So first, it turns out that there are really reasons behind it why the framework had to be rewritten. So it's not like that they thought, well, we have some spare cycles left, let's just write a completely new framework. It's not like that. It's really that Angular 1 is on the market since 2009, I guess, so it's like almost 6 years old, and it was really just not designed for the web of today, and especially not for the web of tomorrow. Like when we think about things like web components and ES6 and asynchronous module loading and these kind of things. So yeah, Angular 1 has problems. It's still a very good and very nice framework, in my opinion, and I really love to use it. But yeah, there are really some pitfalls that need to be tackled, and this is what they do with Angular 2. And this is why in Angular 2 we have, like I just mentioned, like a couple of kind of breaking changes. Actually, the whole thing is a breaking change somehow because it's a completely new framework, but we have things like, so first, Angular 2 is written in Typescript. That's not really a breaking change because that's just what the team is using, and that's great. They're collaborating with Microsoft on that, and that's awesome. I really like that. But when you see code examples, you see all of a sudden you have class syntax. You have those things called decorators or annotations, depending on how you look at them. And then you have a new template syntax that looks weird. You have like parentheses and brackets in the HTML, and then you wonder why is that happening? Like we already have ng-whatever attributes, and now this. So we have a new template syntax. We have the way of writing Angular applications is totally different because it's completely component based. So you don't have the concept of controllers anymore. So it's not that you have like a controller and its scope, but you build rather components that basically are the controller, and the component itself is automatically the execution context. And also the concept of directives has been simplified dramatically. So all these things that turned out to be rather complicated in Angular 1 are actually, I wouldn't say that they're like fixed in Angular 2, but they're now built with a much better thinking in mind, like with the web of tomorrow. And yeah.
So I do have to ask straight away. So based on everything you said, so like if you just describe the framework component-based, like that seems like very in line. You know, using ES6 for a lot of things, all that seems very in line moving forward with where we're going. Why call it Angular 2? You said it. It is a different framework. It is not. It's completely different. Like, is it just the mind share to keep the name going?
Well, actually, that's a good question. I had a couple of discussions on that at conferences, and I think it's really a good point because it's not just a new version of that framework. It's really a different framework. So one can actually argue that it might have been better to come up with a totally different name, like as in it's a new framework and we have a new name, but then I think then you face a lot of other problems. Then people think, oh my gosh, we just built our great applications with Angular, this cool Google framework, whatever, and now Google is working on a new thing, and how do we get there now? Like, so I think it's like you would face the same kind of problems. On the other hand, a lot of things that you know from Angular 1, a lot of concepts, you will have those in Angular 2 as well. So there will still be awesome forms support. You still have directives, internationalization, and these kind of things. So I think when you come from the Angular 1 world, you also really have a much better understanding of why and how Angular 2 works the way it works. So it is a new framework because it's entirely rewritten, but it's still a framework that evolved out of Angular 1, I would say. So Angular 2 might be the best fit from a naming perspective. However, I'm not sure how this is going to work when they say, okay, we're going to use Zemver in order to version our software. Like when there's the first breaking change in Angular 2, is it Angular 3 then? I have no idea. Maybe Angular 2 is really the name, and then it's Angular 2 1. Whatever 1.4. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, it reminds me of two things. It reminds me, one, of Python 2 dot whatever versus 3.
Everyone says that.
I mean, you have to, especially coming from Google. Like, you have to be like, this has already happened. And like, because like I don't remember a lot of how that stuff came about. But the other thing that it reminds me of is, if it is purely for the name, I know it's not as different, but it's like when they decided to rename, what was it called, LiveScript to JavaScript, because the name was more popular. So like it smells a little bit of that to me as well. Not as nearly as intense as either of those, but it's, like I said, it has shades of gray in there.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I don't know. It's just like that. I don't have any any knowledge on this. Why that was the decision. I think it was just the first thing to go. Like, they work. It's the Angular team, right? And they're working on Angular, so it just makes sense.
We talked a little bit about there's no scope, no controllers per se. When I think about Angular's bad parts, and to be fair, there's not a lot of them, but I think dirty checking, change detection in Angular 1 was a really big sticking point.
Mm-hmm.
How is that handled now in Angular 2?
Yeah. So first, again, I wouldn't really say that controllers are entirely gone. Like, the concept or the idea of controllers is gone, but you still have controller classes or controller components, right? So just to make that clear. Regarding change detection, so in Angular 1 we have this thing called two-way data binding, which is awesome. And because you are able to write a lot of stuff without handling a lot of events that you usually have to take care of when writing JavaScript applications. And there's a very simple idea behind it, like how that works. So there are basically three things that can change application state in a JavaScript application, and those are either user events, so like click events or mouse move or whatever, like events. The second thing is AJAX requests. Those can change the application state. And then there's another thing, timeouts, set timeout. Those are the three things that basically can change application state. And they all three have one thing in common, and which is they're all asynchronous. And so what Angular 1 basically does is, like, how does it detect a change? It really just intercepts on each of those three possibilities. So whenever an event happens, then Angular is informed about this event, and this means, hey, Angular, someone clicked that button. So you might want to run some code, and after that code has run, you might want to check if the model is still synchronized with the view or not. So that how it works there. And we have a couple of, I mean, not problems per se, but what happens automatically is that when we use two-way data binding in Angular 1, it can happen that you build an application, it is a bit bigger, a bit more complex, so you have like different states and everything, and then it can really happen that somewhere in the application there's a change happening over here, which then triggers a change somewhere over there, and this change again can trigger another change over here. So it's really hard to reason about what is happening in Angular 1 applications when they're more complex. This is what changes in Angular 2 as well. So so first in Angular 2 we have a component tree. So if you build an application, your application is first an Angular component, right? So, and a component is just a type of a directive. So even your application itself, the whole thing is a directive. It's a component, and it basically is assembled based on other components. So you can say, okay, I have my app, and in my app I have a list of users. So I have a user list component, and in the list of users we have another component, user maybe. So and then you have like a tree like that. And the nice thing about that is that, so since Angular 2 works just with plain old events, it can really only happen that there's so when there's a change happening somewhere, then the change detection only kicks in from top to bottom. So there is no thing like that. The thing that we know as a digest cycle, for example, like the cycle that is running until the model stabilizes, this we don't have anymore. Like you have a component somewhere, it can fire an event, and this will then in turn trigger some change over here, and then it goes all the way down again.
So this honestly sounds a little like, unless I'm wrong, this actually sounds a little bit like Flux, like the one-way data flow.
Yeah, might be. I'm not really into that stuff. I think Flux is just a word for something that we already have since years. I don't know.
Yeah, like it's not a framework or anything like that, but that sounds like, and that's the way that it seems a lot of other things are going now, is with this rather than the two-way binding because of issues like you've said. And there are some people out there that don't think it's a problem, that think that that's something that developers have to worry about, not that the framework should worry about. But you can see, because I think anybody, especially when you write your first large Angular app and you start changing things, you're like, why is this changing? Why isn't this changing?
Correct.
All that kind of stuff. So, and understanding the digest cycle is one of the more complicated things to try to understand when you have to figure out why something is breaking, or why something's not being applied when you think it should be, and that kind of stuff. So having this simplified flow seems like it's a smart idea.
Yeah. So in Angular 2, you don't have a digest cycle anymore. It's really just a digest phase. So it's really just a single cycle always. You have a change that is happening, and boom, it just runs once until the next change happens. So like an event.
That sounds so much less complicated.
Yeah, and it's also much more predictable and much more easier to reason about.
Because I think one of the hardest things when you're dealing with Angular to learn about directives is when that cycle kicks in, the compile step versus the link step versus the pre-whatever steps.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so much that happens in there.
It's really actually in the end it really just boils down to whatever I said, to what I said. Those three things that you have events, you have Ajax calls, and you have set timers. That's actually why you have in Angular 1 ng-click and ng-model and ng-whatever. Those are basically all interceptors that take care of informing the framework to trigger the digest cycle when a change happens, because otherwise Angular wouldn't know. And that's also why you have this thing called scope.$apply that you have to call when something happens outside the Angular world. All this is gone because Angular 2 goes back to the roots more or less, right? So it really so it really just works with events, element events, and element properties. And also there's a new concept of zones. So this is actually something that comes from the Dart world, as far as I know. So it's a concept where you, as an author of some kind of Angular component, even when you do something that is happening outside the Angular world, you don't have to call scope.apply. This is something that just doesn't exist in Angular 2 anymore, because an Angular application always runs in a so-called zone, which basically monkey patches things that can happen asynchronously.
Yeah, that brings up a good point, though. You said it's based on Dart, right? And when I was watching Watchtower.js, when Rob Eisenberg and Caitlin were working on that, or Catlin, I'm probably butchering her name, but they were working on Watchtower.js before Angular 2 came together. Mm-hmm. That was actually originally Dart as well. And when I looked inside of the Angular repository, Angular/Angular, there's something called Dart modules. So is there Dart code inside of the library?
So the Angular 2 code base has evolved in the last month. So as far as I know, all the things that make Angular are basically, they should be able to be used decoupled from the framework itself. So you would have a component for watching changes, that's why you have Watchtower. You have a component for parsing expressions, so that's why you have Expressionist, and these kind of things. And I think those started out as first prototypes of independent components. But to make development easier, we have this Angular 2 repository right now where all the code goes in. And in fact, the Angular 2 code that is currently written has to work in in JavaScript and in Dart. In Angular 1, we had AngularJS, and then we had Angular Dart, which was a part of AngularJS. Actually, the Angular Dart repository was always a couple of steps ahead. It was basically a version of Angular with the learnings from AngularJS. And in order to not maintain two code bases, they said, okay, let's just have a single source tree, which is why we had AtScript in the first place, which is now Typescript. And from this source, they generate JavaScript and Dart. And that's why you have also Dart code in the repository, because there are some layers that you have to. So you have some abstraction that basically says, okay, from here on, you can either use the JavaScript concrete implementation or the Dart implementation. For example, when you work with collections or these kind of things, there might be different implementations on depending on in which environment you are, either Dart or JavaScript. And that's why you have Dart code in the repository, because the actual source that is generated from the source code considers Dart and JavaScript in order to work in both worlds.
So you said something that I know I was confused about a lot when first started hearing about stuff, and that is the AtScript versus TypeScript thing.
Yeah.
So because that was one of the things that's really scary. I mean, me included. Like that, I was like, I don't want to use this AtScript thing. This is weird. And then you heard it was like a subset of TypeScript or something like that, or like TypeScript or like a fork of TypeScript or something, and now. They're just using TypeScript, and is AtScript now a part of TypeScript? So, like, all of those things, can you, like, do you have any insight into, like, how that went from AtScript? What is AtScript? What is TypeScript? And is there any difference between them?
Yeah, sure. So, one thing, like, one other problem that Angular 2 wants to tackle in a very nice way is tooling. So, you as a developer, you should be able to have like nice tools in your IDEs that help you out in building applications, right? So just take a simple AngularJS template. Like when you take a look at that template, you have some directives in there, and they have attributes, and then they have some values. And you as a developer, and also as a consumer of that code, when you take a look at that code, you can't really say if this particular directive uses two-way data binding or not, or if it uses one-way binding top-down or bottom-up. This is all defined by the directive itself. To the outside world, you always just see attributes with values. And so in order to make this better and also easier to reason about, and that's also one of the reasons why the template syntax changed, is that So there were a couple of new things introduced to make tooling easier. Like in JavaScript, you don't have types, for example. Like when you build very, very big applications, it might be better for you and your team to have like types and a compiler that actually tells you that there's something wrong in your code. And that's why the Angular team basically implemented AtScript, which is just ES6 plus types plus something they called annotations. And also, since the code has to work for Dart, and Dart has types, they needed to be something. So our AtScript is basically really just ES6 plus types plus annotations. So AtScript is a superset of ES6. And there's only one compiler out there that actually implemented these two things, and that is the Google compiler. Now it happened that an annotation in Tracer is actually too specific. So you could use Tracer to compile Angular 2 code, and then you can use annotations, and then the compiler, so Tracer, takes care of taking those annotations and doing something with it to your code, because they're just metadata. TypeScript, on the other hand, is a language developed by Microsoft, and they're kind of doing the same thing. They also have types, that's why it's TypeScript, but they also have their own module system kind of thing, and other things, and they were kind of far away from the ES6 spec. So TypeScript was never, and currently it even isn't today, a superset of ES6. So it doesn't fully implement everything of ES6, So it kind of did its own thing, but there was one thing that they had in common, which was they both have types, and so AtScript and TypeScript. And TypeScript also had this feature called decorators. And decorators is basically something. So decorators is basically what we know as annotations in AtScript, just that decorators are more generic. A decorator is something that I, as a consumer, can define and then use. So I can define what a decorator does. It can create annotations, for example. It can do other things, but I'm in charge of defining what a decorator does. Whereas an annotation in AtScript is something that is hard-coded or like hard implemented into the compiler. Because the compiler decides what happens with this particular annotation. So in the end, the team decided to collaborate with Microsoft, as far as I know. So they said, hey, we both actually have the same goals. We want types and we want decorators. So let's just use one thing. Like, we don't need AtScript anymore. And TypeScript, of course, has to make sure that they catch up with the ES6 spec and that they start implementing all these features. Actually, yesterday, TypeScript 1.5 has been released finally. So there was an alpha and a beta out there for a couple of weeks now. And now 1.5 is stable, which actually implements a lot of nice ES6 features and also ES7 features, because decorators are actually a proposed standard for ES7.
Yeah, decorators, my understanding is it's a function basically that runs after or before your
Right.
class, right?
In the end, a decorator is really just a function that has access to a target, and the target can be your class. So that function is basically able to access that class or your whatever, your object, and do some stuff to it. It can decorate it. That's why they call it decorator. And that's, as I said, that's the power that you have as a consumer. You can define what a decorator can do. An annotation in AtScript is just there. You can use it, and the transpiler transpiles it to something. But you're not in charge of defining what an annotation does, even though both things look the same. I actually wrote an article on that explains it in detail.
Cool. Yeah. We'd love to have a link to that so we could post that in the show notes or something as well.
Sure.
It's like I said, this was something that I was very, very confused about when Angular 2 was first announced. And personally, now at work, Erik and I work together. We're working on moving a lot of our stuff over so that we're using ES6 and we're using Babel as the transpiler. And now you can write Angular 2 code in ES5 if you want with ES6 and something like Babel. But it does seem that the recommended way to write Angular 2 code is with TypeScript. Is that accurate?
Well, so I think that the fact that the Angular team uses TypeScript encourages Angular developers also to use TypeScript, and which also in turn will push the Microsoft or the TypeScript community, which I think is good. I think that TypeScript is something that you definitely want to use in bigger applications, like very complex applications with large teams. But if you're just building something yourself or like in a very small team, I think you're totally fine with just ES6. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I was about to say, then you start, at that point you just start getting into the statically typed versus dynamically typed debate of stuff, and that could just go around in circles for
and I think what you can always do is you can just start writing an application in ES6 today and then use a transpiler, and then you can just add types incrementally, because it's in the end it should be a superset of ES6. So if you really decide to switch to TypeScript, all you have to do is you rename your files from .js to .ts, and you're good to go.
And somebody, I can't remember who it is now, somebody explained it to me it made me feel better about it, is that so you're writing TypeScript in your TypeScript files, but valid ES5 code is valid TypeScript code. Valid ES6 code, for the most part, is valid TypeScript code, or will be. Like, I know I'm excited for them to use the ES6 module syntax instead of their own, and a few other things. But eventually, because it sounds like what AtScript was trying to be is what I wish TypeScript was now. which is ES6 with types.
Yeah.
But it sounds like that's where they're going for.
That's exactly what they're doing. Yeah.
TypeScript's been around for a while, and it's the same. It was kind of the same with CoffeeScript, right? Where they weren't trying. They were just trying to make their own thing that they liked better. And some people really liked it, and some people really didn't. And now it seems TypeScript is moving more the way of, okay, we're just, like you said, a superset rather than a replacement for.
Yeah, it's also very nice for refactoring if you have the correct tooling for it. I think Viktor Savkin, one of the core members, he actually wrote an article on that, writing Angular 2 in TypeScript. So in that article, he's actually describing how it is to move from the former code to TypeScript and how it makes refactoring way easier. So that's nice.
Is there plans to get rid of Traceur in the core framework? Like, is the core team planning on removing it altogether, and System.js for that matter?
Well, I think so. Yeah, I think in the end you always, so when you use ES5, you do have to decide on some module system. There's no other way. Like as soon as you use ES6 modules in your ES6 code or TypeScript code, you have to decide on some kind of module system in ES5. And I think they're going to stick with System.js there because that's as close to the spec as everything else out there. I'm also pretty sure that if the code base is not entirely moved to TypeScript yet, then this will happen. I think most of the stuff is already moved to TypeScript. So yeah, so I think Traceur is going to go away then in that project. But I might be wrong on that. But
so what about observables in Angular? That's something that's new, right?
Well, observables is actually, I'm really not an expert on observables, and to be honest, I haven't used them myself yet. So observables is not something that came out of Angular, right? So that's something that already existed before. It's like a way of dealing with data collections and data streams. And the Angular team basically they decided to use like a couple of components inside the framework to use observables for asynchronous, like some kind of synchronous handling. Also, like the whole event system, like when you build an Angular 2 component, and your particular component can fire its own custom event, so that other components from the outside world can consume it. This event handling is also based on observables. So it's really just another thing that is interoperable with Angular.
I saw that the Angular router is replacing the current router, and I know most of us use UI router, right?
Right.
So what are the changes for routing that we can expect? It is a separate project I saw, right?
Yeah. So first, the new router, or it's actually, as far as I know, it's going to be called the component router. It is not going to replace the old router. So if you use ng-route, which is the module of Angular 1 right now, if you use that right now, that's fine. It will stick there forever, probably. There are just no new features or anything implemented for it anymore. The component router is something that will be in addition to that. So the component router is built, so it basically, it is a router that actually works with a component-based application. So the idea is that when you build an application, you should be able to say, okay, I do wanna navigate to this component or to that component. And you don't really care about which URL or whatever. You just say, please navigate to this particular component somewhere in my application, which is what the current ng-route module doesn't do. The current module says, okay, you have a couple of URLs, and I map them to a template and a controller. And whenever this particular URL is visited or navigated to, I will instantiate this particular controller and the template, and then the user sees something. So the component router is really for routing in components. So, and the nice thing is that the component router is, so the code base is also in TypeScript, but there is a small part that is written in ES5 and Angular 1. So the component router has a shared code base between both frameworks, which is pretty cool. So you will be able to use the component router in Angular 2 applications and also Angular 1 applications. And that's actually one of the biggest features, because you will be able to use Angular 2 components and Angular 1 components in one application, more or less. Like saying it in the easy way, you can say you have an application, you can have Angular 2 and Angular 1 components, and you can navigate between those, which is, for example, something that the UI router cannot do. The UI router is still like super duper powerful. It works with states, and it's really the way to go as of right now, in my opinion, especially for bigger applications. But yeah, it is not built for Angular 2 specifically, whereas the component router is.
From what I heard with the components, though, going from one component to the other, is that similar to how the UI router handles going to nested views? Like, is there still a history with those components where you can go back with the back button?
So as far as I know, the component router will support pretty much most of the features that the UI router supports, maybe with a different naming or different mechanisms. But yeah, so in the end, the component router is probably the router you wanna use then. Brian Ford, who's actually building that router currently, he said one day that whenever you ask a question on can the new component router do this and that I know in UI router, then most of the time the answer is actually yes. There will be a solution for this use case.
So I just want to clarify something real quick about that router. So when you say like this, so you navigate between components and things like that, does that mean that so like right now you said with ng router and UI router and stuff, it's a UI router specifically is a state machine, and things are mapped to that URL. So is that going to be different? So like, are we not going to have like specific URLs that we go to?
Well, you can you still define a URL for your route.
Okay.
Right? So you say you have a component, and you can say you navigate to this specific component, and a component configuration can also say, okay, I have this particular URL, and then so I think it's very similar to what the UI router does. So the UI router does it very smart. It's really, as you said, it's a state machine. So you can basically build applications with the UI router without using any URLs at all. You can just say, okay, I have this state and that state and this state, and then you can navigate between those, and there's no change in the URL at all. You can totally do that. So it's really nice and separated. I think in the component router it's going to be very similar. So there are some articles on that. I can share some links later on where we write about how to actually use the new component router in Angular 1 and in Angular 2, and there you can actually see that you can give it an URL in addition. So yeah, this still works.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that clears that up. Then the way that works. So it does work. In that case, it does work similarly to the way that UI router works. It's just with components instead of the normal views that we're used to now.
Yep.
So as far as like services, that's pretty important, right? With Angular 1, where you can use services across controllers, and that's how you share your data. So how is Angular optimizing requests and fetching data? And now that there's no scope, how do we handle modeling our data?
Okay, so first, the recipes that we know in Angular 1 to create services. So we have module.value, we have module.service, we have .factory, we have .provider, and these kind of things. This turned out to be rather confusing. It's not super complicated. It's actually super easy what's happening there, but it confuses people because you have so many ways to actually create a service. So in Angular 2, a service is really just a class. It's an ES6 class. There's nothing more to say. It has its properties, it has its methods, and then you can inject it here and there as you're used to it, and then access those methods and properties. Jeff Cross is working on the HTTP layer, for example, and it's also just a class, or actually it's like a collection of classes with different abstractions that work together, and then it also uses observables for the AJAX calls. in the end, for you as a consumer, you really just say, okay, I have my component right here, and I do want to inject an instance of something that is of type this type. For example, HTTP request or whatever. And then you get an instance of that, and then you can work with that. So how is that glued like to the scope? Because there's no scope anymore, right? As I said, in Angular 2, the component itself that you build, and you can have nested components. The component, every property on a component will be a property that is available in the template. So if you have, let's say, a list of users again, and you fetch them from the server, then this is just a property on your component that you can then just use as an expression in your template.
When are we going to see a stable release?
I don't know. So what I know is that there.
I had to ask.
Yeah, sure. I love that question. So there are internally at Google like over 2,000 applications that are actually written with Angular. I think that since May they're already migrating first apps to Angular 2 and also using that feedback in order to stabilize the Angular 2 APIs and everything. Brett Green and Igor Minar, they both gave a kind of overview on the current roadmap, and there's still a lot of stuff to do. And I think that there will be something that we can use at the end of the year or maybe at the beginning of next year. But yeah, I think there's still a lot of work to do. Angular 1 is still the best Angular you can get right now.
So does that also mean that, and they mentioned this as trying to kind of dissuade some people's fears, once Angular 2 is, I guess you would say, officially released, like if they call it 1.0 or something like that, that doesn't mean the end of 1.x.
Correct.
It's going to continue. There's going to be continued support for, I don't remember exactly how long was stated, but if you're writing Angular 1.x code now, and they're like, and you're like, there might be something stable by the end of the year, beginning next year. That doesn't mean that 1.x support just completely dies.
That's correct. So there are actually a couple of things on that. So a lot of people were scared that when they saw, okay, Angular 2 is totally different, like what is with the stuff that I'm building right now? So there's one fact, and that is whatever you build right now and that works right now will also work in 10 years, no matter what you do. That's how the web works, right? You don't break the web. You have, I think there's no place where you have backwards compatibility as you have in the web. And same goes for your Angular applications. So when you build an Angular application right now and it works, then it will also work in the future, unless there are some super crazy changes in the language itself. What they said at ngConf last year was that there will be support 1.5 years after Angular 2 has been finally released. So there will be official support for Angular 1 applications for 1.5 years. And the transition, the upgrade to Angular 2 will also be rather easy, so because you will be able to use both at the same time and then have a smooth transition.
I think on the Angular organization, they also have a migration app.
Well, it's a repository that currently collects all the upgrade strategies that you might be interested in, because you have a lot of different components that are affected when it comes to upgrade. So, for example, the way directives work and how they work in Angular 1 and how they work in Angular 2, since they're like way specified in Angular 2, you need some way to upgrade those. And then also services, as I said, in Angular 2, they're just classes, so you have to deal those cases, and also routing and these kind of things. So there's also a document that is also linked in that repository that you mentioned that basically describes in like pseudocode what this upgrade mechanism could look like. So there will be interoperable or interoperation libraries. I don't know how to call it. Like there will be like a kind of shim library that you can put on your Angular application in order to mix and match both versions in one application. And that's what the repository is for. If you want to contribute and have some ideas, please leave them there. Sorry.
Do you think, so based on your experience, you have obviously way more Angular 2 experience than I have, and so I've been building Angular 1 apps now, and then say next February, it's like, okay, we want to take a mid-sized application from 1 to 2. Is this something that you foresee being I know this is a terrible question, so I apologize. Is this something you foresee being like a 1 or 2 day exercise, or is this something is this like a multi-week exercise?
You mean to upgrade?
To upgrade from 1 to 2.
Oh, that's something I really can't say. So
Yeah.
because there are like so many things that come into play. It depends on your application. It depends on how you build your application. It depends on what the upgrade path actually will look like. Yeah, it can surely take just a couple of days. It can also take a couple of weeks. It really depends on what you did and what the tools will look like that they will give to us.
Okay.
What I can say is that even today, you can do a lot of stuff to actually prepare for this scenario, right? So you can, for example, write or start writing your applications, your Angular 1 applications in ES6. You don't really have to. You can even write Angular 2 applications in ES5 if you want, but ES6 is the standard, the next version, so eventually you will write it at some point anyways. So you can write your application ES6, which is, I think, already the biggest step. You can even use third-party community projects that bring decorators and annotations to Angular 1 projects. So you can do a lot of stuff today to actually make your code at least look like Angular 2 code, even if it isn't. So if the syntax that you saw the very first time of the Angular 2 project is something that scared you, then I can actually tell you today it doesn't have to, because you can write your Angular 1 application the same way. Like the code can look the same way. It's really just syntax.
Yeah.
It's much more important how you build your application. Also directives, you should build them component-based and these kind of things.
Yeah. The reason, like I said, I know it's a terrible question, but I have to ask because that's something that I know that I'm going to get. I know that's what a lot of other people are going to get too when say like we should upgrade our application from 1 to 2, and that's one of the first things. Like it's not. A lot of it is going to be, why do you want to, that kind of stuff. But the big question is going to be, how long is it going to take? Yeah. How much money is it going to cost me in your time to upgrade from one to the other?
It's really hard to say if you don't really have that experience, if you've never done that before. And it really depends on your application.
Yeah. But also, like you said, you can do. There are things you can do now. That was perfect because that was actually my next question.
Yeah.
There are things you can do now to start getting ready.
Yeah.
So, so thank you. That was perfect.
Awesome.
Would you say that Angular 2 is built with enterprise in mind? Because I know that a lot of Angular apps I've built have been, heavy data on the corporate side or that line of business type of work.
Definitely. So, and I think that's also like one of the reasons why Angular is actually written in TypeScript itself, because it is for big applications. Even the source code of Angular 2 itself is quite big. It's much more simple than the one from Angular 1 currently, as far as I can tell. But it is, in the end, more complex, the way it is structured and these kind of things. So yeah, it is definitely a framework that is especially for large applications. That's also why tooling was one of the highest priorities on that framework. Yeah.
Danny and I are obviously big web components fans, so they're using an Angular Shadow DOM or something similar to that. How are web components being leveraged in Angular 2?
Right. So web components, we have 4 technologies there. We have custom elements, HTML imports, templates, and Shadow DOM. And there is one technology that is pretty much always used, and that is HTML template. And then there is the other technology that is Shadow DOM that you can use if you want. So when you build your Angular components, you can always write them in a way as if they would use Shadow DOM. For example, if you in Angular 1, for example, we have that concept of transclusion, where you build your own custom directive, and then you can take some content and render it somewhere inside a directive. And this is something that will go away with Shadow DOM, because Shadow DOM is solving exactly that. It comes with content insertion points, and that allows you basically to say, okay, I have a content tag right here in my template, and this is where the content goes from the outside world. You can still write your Angular components like that if you need it, even if you don't use Shadow DOM. So Angular 2 allows you to activate Shadow DOM if you want. So there are basically three modes. You can have like a strategy that is called unscoped strategy, like unscoped Shadow DOM strategy. That basically means there's like no Shadow DOM used at all. You have no style encapsulation. You just write your styles as you always did. Then there is a scoped style Shadow DOM strategy emulation. We take care of scoping your styles to really just your component, as you would expect if you use Shadow DOM, but without using Shadow DOM. And then you have the third strategy that is just the native Shadow DOM strategy that basically says, okay, you use Shadow DOM, so we use Shadow DOM, and then you have all the nice things like style encapsulation and DOM tree encapsulation. However, the team kind of moved away of using Shadow DOM as a default because of performance reasons. So it seems like it's not like the nicest thing when it comes to performance. But yeah, in the end, it's up to you. You can always turn it on for just your component if you want. Templates are used for something that was originally known as viewport directives. So you have directives that can change DOM structure, like ngRepeat or ngIf, these kind of directives that really change the DOM structure. Those directives, those type of directives, they use the template tag to actually define and clone a template for structural DOM changes. So those two technologies are used in Angular 2.
Are there any of the polyfills being used from like Web Components JS?
Yeah, so there is the Shadow DOM polyfill from I think from the Polymer project even, that is used for the Shadow DOM emulation. It's not Shady DOM, but so the emulation that Angular 2 has implemented is really an Angular 2 specific Shadow DOM emulation. But I think the polyfill that is used in Angular 2 is the one to make to rewrite the styles that are like with the Shadow DOM style selector, that those are rewritten. I think that's why they have this polyfill, but I'm not entirely sure.
They're still using deep and : shadow?
You can use it as an author of a component, sure. They internally don't really use it. It's not that you have a set of component that is shipped for you. So when you build a component and you want to use styles and style encapsulation, then you need to use those selectors. Or actually, I think deep has actually been removed again, and it's called something else. You can use Shadow DOM if you want.
Yeah, both of them have been deprecated.
Right.
That kind of pushes forward CSS variables.
Right, or CSS properties, it's called even, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Patrick JS, Patrick Stapleton, I think is his surname. I'm not entirely sure. He's working on a specific version, like on a project with Jeffrey Wellblade together, which is so the Angular 2 source has been separated in like two things. It's the render layer and the application layer, and that basically allows you to write Angular 2 applications totally decoupled from the actual render layer. Like whatever your render layer is, you can use the DOM as a render layer. You can use whatever, like React Native as a render layer. So that's pretty cool. And that also allows you to run Angular 2 code in web workers or on the server. And there's a project called Angular/Universal, I think it's a repository on GitHub. And there you can actually follow some actual progress on that, like a server-side rendering. I think it's called Preboot or something. There was a talk at Angular U by those two guys. So you should definitely check that one out.
Thank you for joining us today.
There's my Twitter handle. It's just my name, Pascal Precht, @PascalPrecht. I'm actually tweeting a lot of stuff, also useless stuff, so you can follow me there, and then you get all kinds of updates. You also might want to follow Thoughtram because we're publishing articles very regularly on Angular 2. It's like Thoughtram on Twitter, really just that. And that's actually, I think that's the easiest way to follow me in the internet.
Awesome. Well, thank you again very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at Plus the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Erik Isaksen at eIsaksen,
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.